Henry, let's talk about the history of progressive taxation over recent decades. Governments across the rich world have been implementing extraordinarily progressive policies. You've been writing a piece with our colleague Callum Williams about this. Tell us what's been going on and what's changed over time.
There's a narrative out there that says in the late 20th century, the welfare state was rolled back, government shrank, we had Thatcherism and Reaganism, and we lived in this neoliberal small government environment. But that's not what the figures on redistribution show. The figures on redistribution show that we've got steadily more of it. So if you look in the United States, in 1979, the bottom fifth of earners received 32% of their market incomes in transfers from the government. Today, on the latest figure from the Congressional Budget Office, that's 72%. And the top 1% pay a higher average rate of federal income tax now than they did in 1979, albeit not the highest over the period. And so we've had much more redistribution in America. Now, one counterpoint to that is, of course, that inequality has gone up when you look at people's earnings. So we've got a chart on this, again, showing the CBO data that show what inequality, measured by the Gini index, the common measure of inequality, has done before and after taxes and transfers. And you can see that steady upward trend in the dark red line in inequality before tax and transfers. What you can see in that pinker line beneath is that after tax and transfers, inequality has been much flatter. And we're sort of towards the higher end of the historical range there. So this greater redistribution in America over the long term has lent against this increase in inequality, arguably pretty successfully. Then when you look in the rest of the rich world, it's gone even further, especially since 1990. You have inequality going up in the 80s, but since 1990, inequality after tax and transfers has generally gone down in the rich world. And this has been particularly acute in Europe and especially in Britain. And we have a chart here of British incomes over the past decade or so, and it shows income growth at different positions in the income distribution, 10, 25, 50, 75, 90. You can see as you go up the income distribution, the income growth people have seen really goes down. And that's because British income taxes have become a lot more progressive, a lot more redistribution has gone on. And indeed, inequality in the UK, if you look after taxes and transfers, is now lower than it was in 1986, which is pretty extraordinary given the narrative about ever-rising inequality that you hear in lots of places. So we have been calling this on and off the Robin Hood economy. It's simply the case that governments are doing more redistribution than they used to. And like I said, America is sort of offsetting rising inequality. In Europe, it's swinging the pendulum the other way, and you've got falling inequality in many places. What I will say is that here, of course, we're looking at income. We're not looking at wealth. And what we're really doing is looking at the whole income distribution, or perhaps the top 1%. We're not going up to the really stratospheric end, which I'm sure we'll get onto. So we're not talking about very, very complex tax evasion by extremely wealthy people. But it's simply not true that the top 1% of American taxpayers have been benefiting from these extraordinary wheezes. In fact, in America and elsewhere, governments are becoming way more dependent on the top of income distribution to pay their income tax bills. And that's partly because naturally, if your share of income goes up, your share of the tax take goes up, but it's also because of the increased progressivity in many tax codes. When you look at the cut overall in the US, the top 1% pay 27% of federal taxes against 20% of total income. So it doesn't look like a lot of evasion is going on there that really helps them. That's
very interesting. And give us a sense of who falls into that top 1% of earners. What sort of income levels are we talking about?
I'm not sure exactly where the threshold is on the latest data. It will be something like $600,000 for a household, something like that. You're talking lawyers, bankers, but also in the US, doctors who are have much higher salaries than elsewhere in the world, partly because of the degree of regulatory protection medicine enjoys in the US. So you're talking the standard sort of high-earning professions. You're not talking about the super rich.
So what is the right level at which the rich should be taxed? Now, we asked our subscribers a poll question, and the question was, do the top 1% of earners pay the right amount of tax? 69% said no, they pay too little. 13% said they pay too much, and 18% thought the level was about right. Now, Henry, I'm going to ask you to place yourself on this spectrum here. Do you think the tax system is too progressive or not progressive enough?
Oh, well, you're really putting me on the spot. I think the problem with trying to say what the ideal top rate of tax is that you're just sticking your finger in the air, and everyone likes higher taxes on people who are higher earning than they are. Basically, it's everyone's rough intuition for what the tax system should be. And even if you buy the idea, which I would, that all else equal, you want lower inequality, I also think there's a certain unhealthiness to society if we want to pay for all these things, but we always want other people to pay. I think that's indicative of zero-sum thinking. I think there's essentially no rate at which you could set the top rate of tax on the highest earners that preserves some degree of inequality, where the left wouldn't come back and say, we want it higher still. And yet there's no obvious limiting principle. It doesn't really seem to be that public opinion limits you here, because tax on the rich basically poll well. Economics, and I wrote a column on this, which anyone who read the newsletter advertising the show will have seen the link to, doesn't really provide an answer. It's highly uncertain where you start distorting things. And I don't think the principle either should be we should go after the rich for as much as we possibly can and only stop once we deter economic activity. I think that people, to a degree, have a right to their income. Obviously, they have property rights. The conceptions of fairness shouldn't just be about equality. It's also about rewarding effort, hard work and talent. It's about getting out what you put in. Fairness means more than just equality, whereas the left talks about it tends to be just equality. So I know I've dodged your question there, but I'm sort of our subscriber base isn't unusual in that response, but I don't think it would look radically different if the top rate of tax were 10 points higher. I think the polls would look the same, and I find that disquieting.
That all makes sense, and I forgive you for dodging the question. It was a tough one. Mike, what's your reaction to the poll?
I will say, anyone who thinks our readers are the sort of neoliberal vanguard, look at that. I'm surprised by how sort of I don't know. No, ordinary, I'd say the answers are there. And representing the 13% or potentially the sheriff of Nottingham here in my answer. But I do think that the taxes on the rich are probably in aggregate, at the very least, high enough. I don't personally think the goal of redistribution simply because a pot of income exists is a good social goal. I think it's completely reasonable to decide on a minimum standard of living, some sort of basic level at which people shouldn't fall below, and aspire to reach that. But simply because someone who is rich earns lots of money, that money should be redistributed, I don't agree with. So that for me is the sort of ethical side of it. I think people should be, beyond a reasonable social goal, be allowed to keep what they make. I think the other thing for me is that all of the talk about taxing really high incomes, especially, I mean, taxing wealth is, in economic terms, not a good idea in the first place. But when I think about a tax structure, basically, ideally, you would tax things that are bad in themselves and you're trying to discourage. So you tax things like rents of various types, monopoly activities. Then consumption is a pretty good thing to tax. And I'd be very happy for the consumption of rich people to be taxed at pretty steep rates. If you could design some sort of progressive consumption tax to do that, income a little bit below that, because it funds investment and consumption. So you're hitting with a fairly you're hitting the barn door in doing that. Some of it's good and some of it's bad. And then the worst thing to tax basically is investment and wealth as a proceed of that, because you want people to invest, to grow the economy, to provide that sort of productivity growth. And I think by focusing too much on the incomes of really, really rich people, you're filtering the tax system into that bucket, which is clearly not one of the better ones. So I think, for me, it's not the best thing to do ethically. I don't really see the argument. I think it is just a grab on a group of people that people think are sort of deep-pocketed and the money will just go on forever. And it's not a particularly effective way of running a tax system either.